I call this meeting of the Appropriations Committee to order. I want to welcome everybody to our first full committee markup for fiscal year 2025. We'll first cover our interim 302B allocation numbers, and second, the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Bill. Before we get down to business, I'll offer a few general comments. As all the members are aware, the Appropriations Committee has set out an ambitious schedule for completing our work for fiscal year 2025. This will mean a very busy summer for members and staff alike. Unfortunately, last year's bills were not completed until March of this year, nearly 6 months of our normal process. Regardless of this delay, the committee can and will complete its work on time, which will allow the full House of Representatives to consider these bills expeditiously. Later today, we'll begin marking up the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Bill. I'll have more to say on this bill at the appropriate time, but I want to share a reminder. As most of you know, Judge Carter is here today at great personal sacrifice due to a family health matter, and we must wrap up both markups no later than 6 o'clock to allow Judge Carter to return to his family. Members should feel free to make their points, as always, but I ask that you be as judicious as possible. Having today's markups end on time will ensure our friend can get home where he needs to be. This brings me to another important reminder. The committee will observe the 5-minute rule. You all will see the speaker's remaining time on the screens on either side of the room. When your time is up, the clock will turn red, and I will tap the gavel to remind members that their time has expired. Finally, I'll reiterate that this committee prides itself on its longstanding commitment to orderly and respectful debate. We have a strong tradition of working together and seeking consensus where we can. It's my hope and my intention that we will continue to do so now and into the future, and I thank you all in advance for your cooperation. Our first order of business today is consideration of the report on the interim suballocation of budget allocations for fiscal year 2025. I'll be offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute in the interim allocations that have been circulated to your offices. Before I do, I must ask if any members wish to offer an amendment to the interim 302B report. Hearing no members wishing to offer an amendment to the interim allocations, I'll now recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute to the interim allocation. There's an amendment at the desk, and the clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment in the nature
Without
of a
objection, the reading of the amendment in the nature of a substitute is dispensed with. Our first order of business is the consideration of the interim 302B subcommittee allocations for fiscal year 2025. The committee circulated interim 302B allocations to you all last week. Yesterday, we became aware that the receipts were higher than expected in a couple of our bills. The amendment allows us to even out those funds and put them to good use for the American people. These interim allocations will allow us to begin our work. There are many challenges to our nation's balance sheet. First, we can't overlook that the government of the United States is more than $34 trillion in debt. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that our public debt will exceed the annual economic output of the entire country as soon as next year. It also estimates that interest costs alone will exceed defense spending this year. Clearly, we're on an unsustainable path. An honest accounting of our fiscal state shows that mandatory spending is the main driver of our budgetary crisis, not discretionary spending, which this committee controls. But we still must do our part to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. Second, I would remind you all that the Fiscal Responsibility Act is the law of the land. In the absence of a superseding budget deal, the Fiscal Responsibility Act represents the spending numbers that we must live with, and our bills will reflect that. These allocations not only demonstrate responsible governance and the safeguarding of hard-earned tax dollars, but they also represent our core commitment to strengthening our national defense, supporting the safety and security of the American people, fully funding health care and our nation's veterans, and ensuring that the government remains focused on its core missions. I look forward to a robust debate today, and I urge all members to support the 302B allocations. I'd now like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Ms. Laurel, for any remarks she cares to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding. This is the first full committee markup for the fiscal year 2025. So my congratulations are in order for our full committee chair, Chairman Cole. Mr. Chairman, you are a dear friend, and you are an honest negotiator. We, of course, have our strong differences, disagreements on many matters of policy, but I appreciate that our relationship is built on a strong foundation of mutual respect. And I want to acknowledge our previous chair, Ms. Granger, on her storied and trailblazing tenure on this committee and throughout her long career in public service to our country. Fort Worth is lucky to have such a strong champion coming to bat for them in Washington. And my congratulations, Congressman Granger, on reaching your first Appropriations Committee markup of the fiscal year. While I know we will have cordial and respectful negotiations down the line, quite frankly, I'm experiencing deja vu all over again as we begin down an already well-trodden path towards chaos, division, and shutdown threats. Like last year, we are beginning this year's process with top-line funding levels that fall well short of what the American people need and well short of what both parties already agreed to. A 10% cut for financial services, 11% cut from the labor HHS education bill, 12% from state and foreign operations. How many millionaires and billionaires will you help avoid their taxes and stiff the American people? How many teachers will be pulled from classrooms in your districts? What will workers in your districts do when they lose protection and their wages are stolen by big corporations that employ them? How many families will have to pay for more food, for utilities, if assistance is reduced? What will result from a retraction of our diplomatic corps around the world in the midst of global strife? And what will be the impacts of our national security today and a year from now? The majority's proposed cuts to critical agencies are unserious and destructive. We all know where we will end up. The deals we have already struck and the bills passed and signed into law to end the fiscal year 2024 saga lay out as much. So it is an understatement to say that I'm disappointed that the majority is once again taking us down the path they know they do not have the votes to support. There is a path toward marking up all 12 bills in committee, which did not happen last year, and passing them on the floor. Like last year, final 2025 spending bills will be the product of negotiations between Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate. And we can either do that now, or we can squander another summer on bills that will never see the light of day. Just 2 months ago, over 80% of the members of this committee voted for the final 2024 Appropriations Acts, which provided a non-defense funding level of $778 billion, a 1% increase over the 2023 non-defense top line. But the chair's allocations that we are considering today slashed non-defense funding by more than $67 billion compared to where we were just 2 months ago. But let us talk about where we need to go. We need a starting point for 2025 that provides at least a 1% increase in both defense and non-defense funding, consistent with the Fiscal Responsibility Act framework that House Republicans demanded as the price for averting a catastrophic default last year. Let me pause and be sure you heard the main point I'm making this morning. Democrats will accept nothing less than a 1% increase over 2024 in non-defense and defense funding. That means the starting point for 2025 for non-defense must be at least $786 billion. Instead, the chair's allocations walk away from that commitment and take off the table at least $75 billion in investments for American families. Once again, the majority appears ready to load up appropriations bills with the harmful policies called riders. They have little to do with responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars, but instead divide the country, the Congress, and harm Americans. Riders that make us less safe, move us closer towards Republican goals of a national abortion ban, and riders that discriminate against certain Americans. Like last year, we are beginning this year's process with top-line fundings levels that fall well short of what the American people need and well short of what both parties already agreed to. So I just want to conclude by saying that, again, we will not accept anything less than 1%, and we will make our way forward as this process goes on. And I look forward to our conversations, as I say, in a cordial, respectful manner as we move toward trying to pass bills for 2025. I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from Florida?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is on the 302B allocations.
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to the proposed 302B allocations, both in substance and in their reckless disregard for this process. Last year, we were fresh off of passing the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and Republicans were already backtracking on the agreement by slashing funding for domestic bills from what was just agreed to. This time, after finally passing our FY24 bills more than 6 months late, Republicans are once again backtracking on the bipartisan agreement by underfunding domestic funding bills by at least $75 billion. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Republicans know that in order to adopt passable bills, we need to be writing them to the levels that we all agreed to, which means these bills need to be 1% over what was enacted less than 2 months ago, period. Even Chairman Cole emphasized that these are preliminary allocations and may change when he announced them. Well, I'm not sure what we're waiting for. Chairman Cole said that these allocations are a conversation with House Republicans. Why are we looking at bills designed to satisfy the obsessions of a fringe faction instead of writing bills that would lower costs for American families? Artificially fake funding allocations put politics over people when we need to be working together in good faith to support American workers and families. Obviously, we have very different values and priorities in these discretionary spending bills. At today's MILCON-VA markup, Republicans will continue to claim that they fully fund veterans programs. However, given these pitiful allocations for the remainder of the domestic bills, Republicans cannot credibly claim to fully fund veterans when they are cutting the Transportation and Housing and Urban Development bill by more than 9% compared to current levels, because veterans rely on housing choice vouchers that are funded in the THUD bill. Republicans cannot credibly claim to fully fund veterans when they are cutting the Labor, Health, and Human Services and Education bill by at least 11%, because veterans who are experiencing or are at risk of homelessness rely on critical jobs training programs in the Labor H bill. The MILCON-VA bill is just one piece of the puzzle, and gutting all the other programs that veterans rely on throughout the federal government breaks our promises to veterans, and I cannot and will not support it. We are already in tight fiscal times with the 2-year budget agreement. Why are Republicans insisting on making things worse? With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose the allocations, and I yield back.
Are there other members wishing to make general comments on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Cole, Ranking Member DeLauro, Subcommittee Chair Carter, and Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz. I wish to address the allocation relating to the 2025 Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriation Bill that directly impacts the quality of life for our service members, their families, and our revered veterans as we approach this Memorial Day weekend. Regrettably, the proposal presented by House Republicans deeply concerns me, and I'm asking you to reconsider this particular allocation because it shorts military readiness and the full care we owe to those who bravely served our nation and falls significantly short in addressing the critical infrastructure needs crucial for our military's effectiveness and the well-being of our service members and their families. The proposed $718 million cut in military construction compared to last year directly contradicts our commitments to ensuring that our armed forces are equipped and ready. At a time when our military services have significant challenges in recruitment and retention, partly because of infrastructure, failing to fund military construction, including housing, makes us part of the problem, not the solution, and degrades overall readiness. Moreover, the omission of dedicated funding that deals with base energy independence, despite the increasing frequency of natural, I guess we could call them disasters and impediments that are making it more difficult to complete missions, fail to fortify our installations against environmental threats, and that's a real threat to national security. The bill's approach to Veterans Affairs is equally troubling, and it's disheartening to see the exclusion of critical support for modernizing VA facilities and the shortfalls for care, particularly in an area we know needs increases, and that is mental health services. Our duty is to provide the best for our service members, and this bill as it stands does not fulfill that promise. I hope as we move forward, we can work together across the aisle to revise this bill into legislation that genuinely supports our military and veterans community and meets current needs with respect and to handle care and the support that our military deserves. Thank you so very much, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to make gentleman from Kentucky is recognized?
It should be of no great surprise to any of you that I wish to speak on the long journey that we've had to establish an effective VA electronic health record that's compatible with DOD's. They each have had their own system. We're trying to merge them. Last year, you would have heard me tell you about the story of Travis Fugit, a constituent of mine who was injured in Iraq, lost his eyesight due to the VA's inability to get his health records from DOD. My friends, that was 20 years ago, and we're still not there. And you've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to perfect the merger of those two systems. In the meantime, you've got soldiers who are dying. We have the VA in what's called a strategic pause on deployment of the new record systems. VA has taken this pause as an opportunity to look inward and to fully understand the phrase, "Don't let the perfect get in the way of progress." So here we are in 2024, hopefully nearing the end of this strategic pause. We've got a competent technology vendor. Back in March, the VA successfully deployed the new system at the Lovell Federal Health Community Center in Chicago. I hope that after this successful rollout, more VA facilities can come online soon. I believe this is an issue for VA leadership and with this committee. Starting at the very top, it's my hope that Secretary leans in to address the challenges faced and get this effort moving again. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the strong work of this subcommittee and hopefully this committee with strong oversight that will drive this question as being solved. Now you go back.
Thank you. Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Gentlelady from California is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to these 302B allocations that we're being presented with today. As ranking member of the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I want to state very clearly and unequivocally that, once again, the allocation being presented to us today for the programs of the State Department, USAID, and other related programs is wholly inadequate and irresponsible. This is a cut of close to 12%, taking us back to 2014 levels. It is more than $7 billion below the enacted level for these same programs during a time of growing challenges. Still worse, this follows cuts from the prior year that already have agencies reeling. The challenges the United States and its partners face are immense. Eruptions of violence and war, violations of international borders, proliferation of weapons, including nuclear weapons, famines and pandemics, efforts by dictators to roll back human rights and to undermine democracies. More people are on the move globally than any time in history, all while man-made climate change is destroying crops, lives, and in the case of some island states, entire countries. The challenges of the 21st century can't be solved by one nation. We have to be able to show up, though, and work with others. Diplomacy and development are our first line of defense. Yet the allocations we are asked to vote on treat our national security as something that can be only handled with weapons and war. Somehow the Defense Department never has enough. Meanwhile, we starve these civilian tools that would actually prevent us from having to send American troops and weapons overseas. Yesterday, our subcommittee heard from Secretary of State Anthony Blinken. He testified that the 12% cut that we are voting on today would force the State Department to pull back on educational exchanges, embassy security programs, and slow down new efforts to counter PRC aggression, Russian misinformation, and combat fentanyl and irregular migration. These are priorities that we all agree are important. Why won't we fund the department to tackle these challenges? Americans are traveling more, trading more, and coming into contact with people from all over the world. There are no walls big enough or oceans wide enough to separate us from what affects our neighbors around the world. The Fiscal Responsibility Act was born out of a concern about government spending. Colleagues, the programs in the State and Foreign Operations Bill are far cheaper than military responses, humanitarian catastrophes, and constant crises. This cut is irresponsible, as I said earlier, and will force impossible choices for fiscal 2025 spending. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on these allocations. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Ms. McCollum's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the time. As the ranking member of the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, I want to state clearly why I believe these 301Bs are unacceptable. To increase defense spending by $9 billion in these allocations while cutting $6.8 billion from non-discretionary spending. Now, I broadly support the President's request for defense. Everyone in this room knows I'm committed to our national security. But it's not the equal treatment that I voted for when I agreed to the Fiscal Responsibility Act as negotiated. So I'm going to stand here again, as I did a year ago when Republicans took the same path, that the cuts made to domestic priorities, they in fact do harm our national security. Let me tell you why. Shortchanging workforce development programs undermines the ability to build a military and industrial base that can support advanced manufacturing, cyber talent, emerging technologies that the Department of Defense needs in order to defend our nation. Cuts to the State Department will damage a comprehensive foreign policy strategy that includes defense and a robust diplomatic corps and development efforts. I'm going to paraphrase what you've all heard before. Less diplomacy, more bullets. Failure to invest in climate change, which is a national security situation, which we get reports on, means greater global conflict and instability for generations to come. Now, when we lean solely on defense efforts, we're out of balance. And that's why we are insisting on nothing less than a 1% increase for non-defense spending as a starting piece. Any increase beyond 1% that may get negotiated for defense appropriations must be matched by non-defense investments. And that is the partisan path forward. Now, I'm ready to work across the aisle on allocations so we can get the support of this whole committee. And that's the only way in the end we're going to get this process done. Unfortunately, we cannot get parity between defense and non-defense when the majority is headed down the same path as last year. So that's where these allocations lead us today. I urge my colleagues to vote no on the interim 3201Bs, and I look forward to a more balanced approach, Mr. Chairman, in the future. With that, I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to make general comments on the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Are there any amendments in the second degree to the amendment and the nature of a substitute? Hearing no other members wishing to offer an amendment in the second degree, the question's now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the chair. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Roll call has been requested. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, please raise your hand. A sufficient number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amadei. Yes. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Aye. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Aye. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Aye. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Aye. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Elzey. Aye. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. No. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Aye. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Aye. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Aye. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Aye. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. No. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Mrs. Hinson. Aye. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Joyce. Aye. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter.
No.
Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. No. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Yes. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. No. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Aye. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCollum. No. Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Ming. No. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Aye. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Newhouse. Aye. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. No. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Aye. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres. No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. Ms. Underwood. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Ms. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? The clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 32, the noes are 21. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is adopted. Seeing no further amendments, I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move the committee approve the report on the interim 302B allocations for fiscal year 2025.
The question's now on the motion to favorably report the interim 302B allocations. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Oh, a recorded vote's been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. Sufficient number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amadei. Mr. Amadei, aye. Mrs. Bice. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Elzey. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Mrs. Hinson. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. No. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone? Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke? Mr. Zinke, aye.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Is it? Gentleladies from Ohio is recognized.
Am I recorded, please?
Gentlelady's not recorded.
I'd like to be recorded as a no. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 30, the noes are 22. The motion's agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the report just approved. Seeing no objections, so ordered. Without objection, so ordered. Oh, sorry. Gentlelady is, we agreed to. Our second and last order of business today is consideration of the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2025. I'll now recognize Chairman Carter to present the bill. You can do whatever you want. This, you can sit down.
I'm fine. Well, good morning. Hope y'all are ready to get this thing done. I'm proud to present the fiscal year 2025 Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill today. The bill fully funds veterans' health care and benefits and other services and programs that support America's veterans. As always, we've kept our promise to those who put our nation first. The bill also provides $18 billion for military construction and family housing and is $412 million above the President's budget for fiscal year 2025 for defense. The investments in this bill directly support our national defense by making crucial investments at home and abroad. Key investments include $1.1 billion for 11 barracks and additional funding to provide for future barracks, $2 billion for military family housing, $1 billion for investment in the Pacific, including robust funding for Guam, and for dedicated funding for Indo-PACOM. In closing, I would like to thank the subcommittee members who participated in this process. Your input was made this a very much better bill. My hugest thanks go to our incredible majority staff, Jason Wheelock and Adriana Delgado, who have done tremendous work to put this bill together. Thanks also to Jack Hughes in my personal office. I send my appreciation to our hardworking minority staff, Tyler Cole and Jenny Norschen, sorry, German doesn't work for me, Schuler, who is leading the committee to pursue exciting new opportunities. We wish her all of us wish her our best. Our ranking member, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, you are a great partner, and I appreciate you. I finally would like to thank Chairman Cole and Ranking Member Ms. DeLauro for their support and assistance to the subcommittee.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Ms. Wasserman Schultz for remarks on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank Chairman Carter for his leadership, and I know the whole committee joins me in wishing your wife a speedy recovery, and we're all behind you, and the Appropriations family really wishes her a quick return to health.
Thank you.
I want to congratulate Chairman Cole on holding his first full committee markup today. We'll try not to make this a hazing, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. But I have always had the privilege and pleasure of working side by side with Chairman Cole when we were each one another's ranking member at one point during our appropriations careers, and I know that he will keep his steady hand on the rudder of the appropriations process. And thank you, of course, to Chairwoman Granger for your leadership over not just the last year, but for, as Ranking Member DeLauro said, your trailblazing accomplishments. It was really wonderful as a woman to watch your ascension to the leadership role as the first Republican woman to lead this committee, and I was proud to work under your leadership. And of course, thank you to Ranking Member Rosa DeLauro for your always steady hand in guiding our work here on the Appropriations Committee. Chairman Carter, it is really such a privilege to work by your side. We really are genuine friends, and much of the time, I think, left to our own devices, which unfortunately we are not, this bill would look virtually the same no matter which one of us was to write it. But of course, there are others who have an interest in this markup and in the chair's mark. And so, unfortunately, it is with a truly heavy heart that while I've appreciated the work that we've done together over the past few years, and I know that we both prioritize the quality of life for our service members and their families and caring for our veterans, unfortunately, I am unable to support this bill. To start, the bill before us today is built on a framework that walks away from the Bipartisan Fiscal Responsibility Act yet again. Last year, the ink was barely dry on the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and Republicans essentially tore up that agreement, marking up bills at dramatically lower levels to the point that even the Republican majority couldn't get them off the floor. And somehow we find ourselves in the same position with 302B allocations that once again broke the bipartisan FRA agreement, which was the basis for the bills that we passed, as I said earlier, just a couple of months ago. While the FY25 MILCON-VA bill doesn't face cuts as dramatic as other bills, veterans and service members and their families, as I said in my 302B remarks, rely on programs throughout the federal government. The Fiscal Responsibility Act already only allows for a 1% increase this year, and these top-line funding levels are not only not an increase over last year, they are dramatic cuts to current funding levels. They are leaving at least $75 billion on the table that we should be using for non-defense discretionary programs, consistent with the 1% increase over the agreement that most of us in this room made mere months ago. On the military construction side, this bill cuts funding for service members and their families by $718 million compared to the enacted level, compared to current services. That's definitely not a 1% increase. And while I do appreciate the investments that Chairman Carter made in BRAC, including my requests for dedicated funding for PFAS remediation and increased funding for the oversight of DoD housing, at the same time, the cut to military construction of $718 million from current services will slow crucial progress to modernize and improve DoD's infrastructure. Furthermore, neglecting to continue dedicated funding to protect our installations from climate change is a national security risk. We all know how extremely costly disaster recovery funding is, and we have an opportunity to get ahead of it. Last year, we provided DoD with $30 million in dedicated funding for resiliency, a comparatively small sum of funding now, which will pay huge dividends in the future and ensure our national security in the face of our changing climate. By eliminating the dedicated resilience funding this year, this bill would threaten future military readiness. Cutting military construction now slows our historically bipartisan efforts to reduce the infrastructure backlog, to strengthen our national security, and to improve the quality of life of our service members and their families. We are backtracking on our commitment to our service members and their families by cutting funding for military construction. But perhaps the most egregious part of the bill is all of the partisan culture war riders that it includes. Riders that include preventing VA from implementing its interim final rule on abortion, which is now final, by the way, to provide abortion services under limited circumstances and abortion counseling, and to ensure that veterans have equal access to health care regardless of what state they live in, especially in a time when reproductive rights are under attack around the country. A woman's decision on whether or not to have an abortion should be made between her and her doctor and her family. It should not be made by the people in this room. It includes riders that do everything from prohibiting VA from implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, as well as training, to a petty, bigoted prohibition from flying the pride flag over VA facilities, from protecting people who speak or act under the guise of religious freedom, essentially authorizing the arbitrary discrimination against LGBTQI plus people, and from prohibiting access to gender-affirming care, just to name a few, aimed to disenfranchise veterans from VA. The United States did not make exceptions to the promises we made service members in exchange for their service and sacrifice. We made promises to everyone, to all of them. This bill undermines VA's ability to report a beneficiary to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, to keep guns out of the hands of people who are prohibited under federal law from purchasing or possessing firearms. It prohibits VA from following the law that is intended to protect veterans and those around them. It truly is a shame that this bill includes these poison pill riders. They create division between us unnecessarily when we should all have a shared goal of providing health care and benefits to veterans. VA's mission is to, quote, fulfill President Lincoln's promise to care for those who have served in our nation's military and for their families, caregivers, and survivors. That is what we should be focusing on here today. How best to ensure veterans are receiving the best care at the VA and how best to take care of our service members and their families. We should not be wasting our time arguing over partisan riders that have no chance of becoming law. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank not only Tyler Coey and Samantha Price on my personal staff, but I want to make sure to acknowledge, again, Jenny Nuschler, who has done a remarkable job on this committee for the last 9 years, serving on several of our subcommittees, and who is here for her last markup at the full committee level of the MILCON-VA subcommittee. She will leave us at the end of next week. She has done a remarkable job. If anyone here has ever interacted with Jenny as I have, and so many have, she is, I don't know how she finds a way to wake up on the sunny side of the bed every single morning, but she always has a smile on her face. She maintains her composure under the most stressful situations. I am so proud of her as a young mom, balancing work and family every single day, making it look easy, and making sure that I and my colleagues are prepared no matter what comes up and no matter what is thrown our way or hers. We will miss you, Jenny. Thank you so much for the remarkable job you've done. You have earned the rest, which I know those folks on outside the process seem to somehow get and are able to leave the office at 5 o'clock and stay left. Thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you, Chairman Carter, and to your staff as well. I yield back.
I now recognize myself for remarks on the bill. I'd once again like to welcome everyone to our first full committee bill markup for fiscal year 2025. It's deeply fitting that the first bill we will be considering is the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Bill. As members know from our earlier markup, the subcommittee allocations reflect both a prudent stewardship of scarce taxpayer dollars and a recommendation as to where our priorities must be. Today's bill covers one of our major priorities, to provide full funding for health care and benefits for our nation's veterans. This ensures that our veterans can get the services that they earn through the service to a grateful nation. In addition, the bill also provides robust but responsible funding for military construction projects with a particular focus on the Pacific region and on military family housing. It ensures that we meet our national defense needs both at home and abroad. Notably, it fulfills these priorities while also remaining true to the budgetary levels outlined in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is the law of the land. But in a reflection of the deep importance of this topic to members of this committee, today's bill actually appropriates over $400 million more. That's right, more than the president's budget's request. So this will ensure that we can meet military construction and overall defense needs both now and into the future. I want to thank Chairman Carter, all the members and staff of both sides of the aisle for their hard work on this bill, and I urge all members of the committee to support it today. And now I'd like to recognize my good friend, distinguished ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, or excuse me, Ms. DeLauro, for remarks on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and to Chairman Carter, best wishes to you and to your wife and to your family. I know they're difficult times when a loved one is experiencing difficulty. So know that our thoughts and our prayers are with you and with your family. So before we begin, I want to thank all of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Subcommittee on both sides of the aisle for their work, and particularly Jenny Noschler and Tyler Coe. After nearly 10 years on the committee, Jenny is departing at the end of the month. Every day, she has brought unmatched work, an ethic, a knowledge, a passion, of a commitment to her job, ensuring that the subcommittee carries on its mission to America's veterans. She has done it with a wonderful smile and a tremendous personality while being a mom to a very lively 19-month-old Charlie. We're sad to lose Jenny, but she's left an indelible mark on this committee and on appropriations bills for this subcommittee, as well as on the Transportation and Housing and Urban Development Subcommittee. I hope this means a little bit more time with Charlie. We say thank you to you, Jenny, for everything that you've done and your great public service to Congress and the nation. It was Shirley Chisholm, first African-American woman who served in the House of Representatives, said, "Public service is the rent we pay for space on this earth." You've paid the rent over and over again, Jenny. Best. Now on to the bill before us in the committee today. As we discussed this morning, it's my view that Republicans are heading down an already well-trodden path towards chaos, division, and shutdown threats. Like last year, we are beginning this process with top-line funding levels that fall short of what the American people need and are short of what both parties have agreed to, taking at least $75 billion in investments for American families off the table. Once again, the majority appears to be loading up appropriations bills with harmful policies that have little to do with responsible stewardship of taxpayer dollars, but needlessly divide the country, divide the Congress, and harm Americans, and will go nowhere, as we experienced in 2024. Like last year, final 2025 spending bills will be the product of negotiations between Republicans and Democrats in the House and in the Senate. And we can either do that now, or we can squander another summer on bills that will never see the light of day. The bill before us today would hurt our veterans and military readiness, a worsened quality of life for service members and their families. It leaves our military construction, service members, veterans, and their families vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and worsening natural disasters. And it harms women and moves us closer to a national ban on abortion. This bill disarms our military in the face of the climate crisis. It fails to include any dedicated funding for resilience projects to help protect our bases and installations from rising sea levels and extreme weather. Do not take my word, just my word for it. Look at the bill. Last year, we provided $30 million in targeted funding to improve the resiliency of our military installations against sea level rise, flooding, extreme weather events, to improve military readiness and to protect our service members. This year's bill provides zero, nothing. And the bill walks back investments made in natural disaster recovery funds to help our military recover from the ever-worsening disasters. Last year's bill provided $150 million to help Tyndall Air Force Base build back from Hurricane Michael. This year's bill cuts this still needed investment by $50 million, meaning it will take a much longer time to build back. Failing to allow our military to confront the threats posed by a rapidly changing climate puts our service members in harm's way, hurts America's military readiness, and our national security. Military leaders, including under former President Trump, have warned of the dangers that climate change poses to our military. Former Secretary Mattis warned that climate change threatened American interests and the Department of Defense's assets around the world, and said climate change is, and I quote, a challenge that requires a broader whole-of-government response, end quote. This bill endangers veterans, recklessly undermines the ability to keep guns out of the hands of those prohibited under federal law from purchasing or possessing firearms because they could be potentially harmful to themselves and to others. The VA is now out of compliance with federal law, which prohibits firearm access for anyone deemed incapable of handling their own financial affairs due to a mental condition. This is decades-old legislation. It was put in place to protect people from harming themselves and harming others. And finally, this bill is a direct attack on women veterans, who are the fastest-growing demographic served by the Department of Veterans Affairs, tripling from 160,000 in 2001 to more than 600,000 last year, with a policy rider that limits abortion access and prohibits abortion counseling. The women who volunteered to serve and defend our nation, to protect our country's most sacrosanct rights and freedoms, should not come home to find their medical care and family planning decisions being made by anyone other than themselves, their families, and their doctors. This is just one more way in which Republicans are prioritizing pushing our country towards a national abortion ban above everything else. We will defeat every one of these anti-choice riders, just as we did last year. The majority may want to suggest that they are supporting our veterans' needs, but we all know that this bill alone does not contain all the programs most vulnerable veterans depend on. The cuts the majority is seeking across the other funding bills will harm and neglect many of the heroes who bravely defended this nation. At least 1.2 million veterans rely on food stamps for nutrition assistance. Tens of thousands of veterans rely on housing vouchers. Thousands of veterans utilize job training programs to reenter civilian life. All of these programs and many others may face severe cuts as we move forward with the funding level that have been proposed by the majority. So do not tell me that Republicans are fully funding veterans programs. The larger Republican agenda does nothing to protect veterans from the proposed cuts. Cannot support this bill, and I hope my colleagues in the majority will reconsider their strategy. Join us at the table. Let's support our veterans, our service members, support our workers and families, and above all, it is time to govern. Thank you, and I yield back.
Are there other members wishing to make general comments about the bill? Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Time, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned earlier about my concern about the cuts to the other bills with the increase that defense was receiving. And it's a 4% cut. And I'm just going to try that together into national security for those of us who serve on the Defense Subcommittee. That includes Subcommittee Chairman Carter and Mr. Cuellar. We heard testimony time and time again from each of the service chiefs about the quality of life that are top priority when it comes to retaining military service members. It includes barracks, child development centers, family housing, and those are all components of this bill. The Army and the Marine Corps particularly have made funding facilities, sustainment, restoration, and modernization accounts top in their priority budgets this request year. All across the services, that totals up to $18 billion in FY25. Now, Mr. Calvert and I must manage the defense bill, and we do so in a way that I think reflects our mutual care about our national security in this committee. But what we see in the Defense Committee is the downstream impacts when we don't do what we should be doing in military construction. So I believe we must prioritize more fully military construction. Now, the funding in this bill is above the president's request. It is still $700 million below last year. So that means things aren't being done. We're going to continue to increase facility maintenance costs in the defense bill in the future by not repairing, fixing, and replacing things today in this bill. This is money that the Department of Defense could be using to prioritize other personal readiness issues or the modernization of our military. Similarly, the shipyard infrastructure optimizations plan also was funded to the president's request, but it is still $430 million under enacted level. We know that many of our shipyards are woefully deficient in constructing and sustaining a Navy that can successfully deter our adversaries. The backlog of the Virginia-class submarines, the backlog of submarine maintenance all over are just some prime examples of what I'm talking about. So again, the fact that I would like to see more funding prioritized in this bill will help with what must be prioritized in the defense bill. Infrastructure is a key component of building military readiness. And even though we all must deal with the caps imposed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act, we must continue to work harder to provide housing for our service members and to have our shipyards ready to build what we need, ready to build what we must maintain in order to keep our nation secure. And I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations on your first markup. I want to also thank Chairman Carter for your leadership on this fantastic VA bill that does, in fact, fully fund our veterans, and in fact is nearly $500 million higher than what the president requested in his budget request earlier this year. Last year, I talked about the large gap that we still have to cover. The VA has a long way to go in terms of taking care of our veterans and providing them the customer service that is commensurate with the valor of our heroes who have served. And we talked about a lot of those weaknesses. In my district, in North LA County, our veterans have to drive 3 to 4 hours just to get to the West LA VA facility. And in many cases, we had a high percentage of appointments just being unilaterally canceled by the time the veteran got there. So these have been documented weaknesses, and for my constituents, this is one of the most veteran-dense areas of the country in North LA County. It's a huge problem for us. We're inside the 50-mile radius, but it could be 3 to 4 hours drive in LA traffic. We did bring out the VA director for the LA Healthcare Center to come see our problems firsthand and to see the weaknesses that we've had. And I'm happy to report that he's committed to bringing a VA mobile van up to our district on a monthly basis, which decompresses the workload at the West LA facility and gets availability to our vets directly. And he also committed to opening a full-service, community-based outpatient center in the northern part of my district where it was needed the most. In less than 2 years, we'll have this new facility up and running. So there are shoots of hope. I think the VA has a long way to go to improve, but we are seeing them start to prioritize customer service. So this is a fantastic continuation of an upward trajectory in service to our veterans. And just the improvements in the last 12 months, I think, are testimony as to why we need to continue to fully fund the VA and the MILCON efforts behind them. And I urge support of this good bill. I yield back. Thank you.
Ms. Lee of Nevada is recognized.
Hello. Oh, there we go. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member DeLauro. I rise today because I had hoped what has traditionally been a bipartisan process of supporting our veterans and service members, you know, especially after last year's shenanigans, all of which ultimately held their benefits hostage and threatened to delay services that they rely on for months. And now, once again, we're debating a grab bag of partisan wins that has been snuck into what for years has been a bipartisan process. And in fact, it's hard to think of an issue that we can all agree on more than caring for the men and women and their families who made so many sacrifices and services in service for our country. But when this bill cuts over $700 million for MILCON-VA, I have to think again. When I go back to Las Vegas and actually get a chance to speak to our service members and veterans, they want to know what we're doing for reliable, affordable housing, how we can improve medical care, especially access to mental health care, or how we can help them raise a family while serving our country. In my time on this committee, I've been proud to fight for funding for our Southern Nevada veterans and active duty service members. I wish that we could go back to discussing child care options that for families on military bases, or how to secure housing for those who deserve just a roof over their heads. I refuse to believe that we can't get back to that. And so I urge my colleagues across the aisle to, focus on what we're doing here, which is cutting hundreds of millions of dollars, all at a time when we know that 30% of our military bases are in desperate need of repair. And if that's not bad enough, these provisions that have included to strip women of their health care options and freedom to make their own decisions. This is for women who have risked their lives to protect those very freedoms, and we shouldn't be taking away theirs once they come home. But that's exactly what this bill has done by prohibiting the VA from offering abortion counseling and reproductive care to our veterans and beneficiaries. Our veterans already face significant barriers to care at a time when states all across this country are decimating access to abortion. Eliminating abortion access at VA facilities would be yet another hurdle, this time specifically targeting those women who have served our nation. Since the fall of Roe v. Wade, we know that anti-choice extremists have been hell-bent on a nationwide abortion ban. And it's so sad to see that a bill that's meant for improving our military bases and getting veterans health care be used to take us one step further towards that goal. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this bill, and let's get back to work to actually giving our service members, military families, and veterans the support they need. Thank you. I yield.
Are there other members wishing to make general comments about the bill? Seeing no other members wishing to make opening remarks, I would like to recognize Chairman Carter to offer a manager's amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll rise to offer a manager's amendment. It includes bipartisan language. It includes other changes that both sides have agreed to, and I urge its adoption.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
We have no objections to the manager's amendment.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment? The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz for putting language in this amendment that addresses the P8 parking aprons at Naval Air Station, Jacksonville. I can tell you the P8s, as you all know, has added a tremendous capability to the patrol and reconnaissance mission that these airplanes fly out of Jacksonville. However, they also brought a lot of weight, and they have begun to crush under them the concrete aprons, and which is not really is a major problem, and it has affected their readiness capability. And they've got a very slow process for fixing these. So I want to thank you for including that language. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair will remind people when you address the group, you're supposed to stand. All right. Mr. Gonzalez from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Cole, and thank you for your leadership, Chairman Carter, for this. I'm very pleased to see the consideration of my amendment to improve veteran cemeteries across the country added into this manager's amendment. My grandfather was 18 years old when he was drafted in World War II, and he landed on the beaches of France. And he later went on to fight and kill Nazis in the Battle of the Bulge. And today he is buried at Fort Sam Houston in in San Antonio, like many South Texans are. And that is a very, very special place. I fought and killed Islamic extremists in Afghanistan and Iraq. After 20 years, I will be buried at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio. I think this committee does a great job of taking care of veterans, but we also have to remember their last final resting place. And a big part of that is making sure that the VA is working on our cemeteries. That is why my amendment requests a report on cemetery projects as to their repair and what is needed in order to complete these oftentimes well past due projects due to a lack of resources. This committee should be doing everything it can to prioritize the final resting place of our veterans. I want to thank the committee for considering my amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
Thank you. The chair would note that he hopes the gentleman lives far longer than 20 years.
Yeah, me too.
Are there others wishing to be recognized? I recognize Chairman Carter for 1 minute to close.
Well, this is agreed to, and I just urge its adoption.
Questions on the amendment? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment's adopted.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady's recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask unanimous consent that it be considered as read.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This amendment includes striking 13 poison pill culture riders that are in the bill, along with associated report language. To start with, this amendment strikes Section 255 that prohibits VA from implementing its interim final rule on abortions. VA put in place its interim final rule on abortions back in September of 2022 in an effort to respond to the Dobbs decision that reversed the longstanding federal protection for abortion care in the United States, and they made that rule final this past March. With women's reproductive rights crashing down around us throughout the country, I applaud VA for standing up to do the right thing to ensure that veterans, no matter what state they live in, would be promised reproductive health protections. Currently, VA allows for abortion counseling and abortions in the limited cases of rape or incest, or if the life or health of the mother is at risk. This bill removes VA's authority to provide this needed health care to only allowing abortions in the case of rape, incest, or the life of the mother. A woman has to be dying in order to have access to an abortion, never mind if an abortion is in the best medical interest of the veteran. How is it 2024 and women are still fighting for their reproductive rights? I'd like to know why anyone in this room believes they have the authority to make personal life-altering decisions for another person. These decisions should be made between the patient and their doctors and their families. No one, especially not politicians, not judges, or the government, has any right to say otherwise. Speaking of another issue that we have no place in muddying the waters is in Section 261 of the bill, where it prevents VA from reporting a beneficiary that has been deemed mentally incompetent based on medical evidence and therefore is assigned a fiduciary to protect them when handling their finances. And it prohibits that person from being referred to the National Instant Background Check System as is required by longstanding federal law. This reporting prevents the beneficiary from purchasing a firearm. The program has a full due process system, and veterans can file an appeal. This is an example of generating controversy where there is none. The process of applying for disability benefits is separate from the processes by which veterans receive VA health care. The Veterans Health Administration does not take away veterans' firearms. But by implying that VA bureaucrats are going to take guns away from veterans, this provision not only does nothing to increase access to care, it seeks to dissuade veterans from even seeking the health care they've earned in the first place. This is about keeping veterans and those around them safe. The Supreme Court has repeatedly emphasized that the core of the Second Amendment right is self-defense. Assigning a fiduciary to handle financial benefits does not interfere with self-defense, but rather it is seeking to protect and avoid injuries and deaths from suicide and accidents. On the military construction side, this amendment strikes the two sections related to Guantanamo Bay that the majority for some reason has once again included, despite the fact that it is unnecessary and inapplicable to anything that is actually in the bill. The MILCON-VA bill again this year does not include any funding for housing individuals detained at Guantanamo Bay, nor is there any proposal to close Guantanamo Bay. As I pointed out last year, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration, now in 5 consecutive years, have proposed the removal of this exact same language in their budget requests. These policy riders do nothing to bring us closer to a bipartisan agreement to fund the needs of our service members, veterans, and their families. But there's more. The bill is seeking to prohibit surgical procedures or hormone therapies for gender-affirming care, to limit the ability to fly flags at VA facilities, which is just aimed to eliminate the use of pride flags, and it creates a license to discriminate against LGBTQI+ people under the guise of religious liberty. This bill prohibits implementing climate change executive orders. It prohibits VA from requiring healthcare personnel being vaccinated against COVID-19, and somehow we're also still talking about mask mandates. This bill is seeking to stop VA from providing financial services to ICE, not healthcare services, and again includes a petty prohibition against influencing congressional action. This list of riders is embarrassing, and spending our time debating these poison pill riders when we know where we will end up at the end of the day is a waste of time. The majority has proven once again who is steering the ship of the Republican Party, the MAGA extremists who don't care about governing responsibly. Our veterans, service members, and their families deserve so much better than this. We're going to end up striking these riders. I don't know why we're wasting time when we should be spending time on whether or not we are doing enough to prevent veterans from committing suicide, making sure they're not homeless, and taking care of their health. I urge your support of the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Chairman Carter, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I rise in opposition to the General Lady's amendment. This amendment seeks to remove various provisions that are important to my Republican colleagues. It's important that we retain critical provisions to keep the dangerous detainees at Guantanamo Bay away from the American people. If a facility is built on house detainees in the on U.S. soil, it would put Americans at an unnecessary risk. And I can't think of any congressman in the district or congressional district that would want these detained people in their district. So this amendment also strikes the Hyde language. Taxpayers would not have to pay for elective abortions. I urge my colleagues to vote against Ms. Wasserman Schultz's amendment. Yield back.
Gentlelady from Connecticut, the ranking member, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong support of this amendment. This amendment would strike riders inserted into the MILCON-VA bill by my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. This is once again House Republicans choosing to waste time instead of governing pure and simple. We will eliminate all of these riders. That has been the past experience. The harmful provisions have absolutely nothing to do with improving the lives of our nation's veterans, our service members, or their families. They are not related to helping our nation's veterans, service members, or their families. They are inappropriate. They are meant, quite frankly, to score political points in some way for the majority, and I believe that that will backfire. Abortion is health care, plain and simple. There is no one more deserving of health care than those who have fought and been injured on behalf of our country. The VA's rule on reproductive health services recognizes this fact and the fact that barriers to accessing abortion can be dangerous and even deadly. The bill put forward today would take us backwards, put the well-being of millions of veterans at risk as a result. And veterans of reproductive age in particular have high rates of chronic medical and mental health conditions that may increase the risks associated with pregnancy. It is beyond unacceptable for our women veterans. They comprise approximately 10% of the veteran community. They fought to defend our rights abroad. They come home and find that they have been stripped of their own rights to make decisions about their bodies. We will defeat every one of these anti-choice riders, just as we did last year. And it is troubling that we are being forced to waste time and go through this process again as we did last year instead of governing. Furthermore, Republicans have once again included a dangerous rider that would endanger veterans and those around them and puts the VA out of compliance with decades-old federal law. This is not the VA deciding to take guns out of the hands of veterans, as some recklessly suggest. This is about the VA's legal reporting responsibility. Once a determination of mental incompetency has been made, solely in conjunction with a veteran's financial benefits. It is about protecting veterans from potentially harming themselves or others. This bill protects guns more than it protects veterans. These riders are reprehensible, they're shameful. Ms. Wasserman Schultz's amendment strikes these provisions, and I am proud to vote in favor of it, and I urge my colleagues to do so. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentleman from Alabama, Chairman Adderholz recognized.
Thank you. I want to speak in opposition to the Wasserman-Schultz amendment, which violates not only the right to life, but undermines the power of Congress here in the committee in which we sit. Today, the law of the land prohibits the VA from using tax dollars to fund abortions, as clearly stated in the Veterans Health Care Act of 1992. The administration has decided to ignore federal and state law by moving forward with a plan that uses taxpayer dollars to fund abortions at veterans' health care facilities. The VA needs to use its limited resources on providing health care services related to veterans' military service and specific needs, not procedures to terminate human life. Regardless of your view on the moral issue of life, all members of this committee should be troubled by the growing trend of the executive branch to willfully ignore Congress's will. We should not stand for it, and I urge a caution in setting a dangerous precedent, and I would urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Lee, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz's amendment. This bill, again, it attacks our veterans' bodily autonomy. The majority are trying to implement an abortion ban for our nation's veterans and their families, an abortion ban for our nation's largest healthcare system and the millions of people it serves. So yet again, it seems that our Republican colleagues have forgotten, and I ask you, do you think you know better than the veterans that you represent what is best for their bodies, their families? Do you truly think that you have the right to make personal, mind you, personal medical decisions for our veterans and the doctors and the healthcare providers who provide for them? And I also thank Ranking Member Wasserman Schultz for her amendment to remove language from this bill that would keep open the infamous Guantanamo prison camp. More than 2 decades, mind you, after 9/11, this camp does nothing to keep America safe, but it does give leverage to dictators who like to accuse America of hypocrisy. And I don't understand the obsession of some of my colleagues with defending this indefensible prison. They suggest that shutting down this sad, almost empty prison is an expression of weakness. But what it does say, and what it says about America's strength, is that we won't fight to uphold our most basic value of human rights. And so, quite naturally, I adamantly oppose any attempt to keep Guantanamo prison camp open. These riders really, once again, are shameful and should be removed. As co-chair of the Congressional Pro-Choice Caucus, I strongly support the ranking member's amendment, and I hope all of my colleagues will join me in voting yes. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frankel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As a proud mother of a United States war veteran, I am all too familiar with the risks that our brave men and women in uniform take every day. So it saddens me to say one more time, you got it. My. Here we go again. Are you kidding? Really? Once again, Republicans aiming to interfere with the personal decision of women and their freedom to decide when or whether to start a family. This time, aiming their fire at the women who served our country in uniform. I support the Democrats' amendment and vehemently oppose Republicans' proposed changes to the Veteran Affairs rule that currently allows VA clinics to provide abortion counseling and abortion cases in cases of rape, incest, or when the health of the mother is at risk. The Republican changes would cruelly restrict these essential services and eliminate abortion counseling altogether, potentially impacting nearly 1 million women veterans of childbearing age who may depend on the VA for their health care. The current rule acknowledges the complex circumstances that a woman may encounter when deciding whether to continue her pregnancy and ensures that she receives the compassionate care that she deserves. Eliminating abortion counseling strips away the lifeline of professional guidance and emotional support. It may leave a veteran isolated, confused, and vulnerable at a time when she needs help the most. And restricting abortions to only life-threatening situations while ignoring other serious health risks is both medically unsound and morally unjust. And this is especially harmful to the veterans who live in the states that prohibit or severely restrict access to legal abortion. The Republican bill without the Democratic amendment is a betrayal of our commitment to honor and support those who have bravely served our nation. These proposed changes are not just a rollback of medical rights, they are a profound failure to stand for our veterans when in their time of need. And we owe nothing less than a full support in maintaining their health and well-being. And with that, I yield back asking support of this amendment.
Are there any other members wishing to speak? The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in strong support of Ms. Wasserman's amendment, which both the ranking member of the full committee and the ranking member of MILCON has clearly said aren't going to be adopted. But I rise for a different reason. I hear a lot of talk about saving money in the federal government. I hear a lot of talk about the deficit. I hear a lot of talk about fiscal responsibility. Guantanamo Bay is the most expensive prison in the world. In the world. And you are voting to spend $19 million for one prisoner. And then you talk to me about fiscal responsibility. $19 million for one prisoner. We have serial killers that are in prisons here in America. Some in the highest security prison, from which I believe there has been no escape. There are terrorists in prison on the mainland. How can you responsibly say I'm for fiscal responsibility when for political sake, not for security's sake, we can keep prisoners secure here in the United States in prisons that already exist? And I don't know off the top of my head what the price would be, but I got a feeling it's probably less than $1 million. $19 million. So you're spending $18 million per prisoner for political messaging about how tough you are on terrorists. We all want to be tough on terrorists. We all want to keep our citizens safe from being threatened by terrorists. And that's why we have maximum security prisons. But don't talk to me about fiscal responsibility when for political purposes, for political messaging, you want to spend $19 million to house one prisoner. I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be recognized? Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. guns, gays, germs, Guantanamo, banning abortion, denying climate change, not asking departments questions. If we were playing Jeopardy, I would have taken, what is the Oversight and Government Reform Committee taking up today for 1,000? Unfortunately, it's the Appropriations Committee. Look, we have women who are veterans and military personnel. We have LGBT community members who are veterans and military personnel. We have people of color who are veterans and military personnel, and that'll be in another amendment when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion. And this is an insult to all of them when we put these riders on in the appropriations process. I understand the modern Republican Party has to do certain things, but I think we should also understand that in the last budget, 99% of these were taken away, and then the adults in the collective room got a appropriations process done. I just hope that we wouldn't be doing that again this year, and maybe there can be some ways to not do that with the additional bills we have. Just sad to hear it. Watching Oversight and Government Reform last week was one of the saddest moments I've had since being in Congress. I had to talk to a group on Saturday, and I asked what they thought Congress did that week, and all they knew is people debated about eyelashes and blonde hair and drinking at 8 o'clock at night because they had to schedule a committee hearing while other people had to go to New York. I mean, we have become, Saturday Night Live in action here in Congress, unfortunately, and this committee's always been above that. So, Mr. Chair, I have great respect for you, and I know we've had a little talk about this, but I hope that we can maybe not go down this way throughout the entire process. I do think we are above this, and I hope we all acknowledge that, and I support this amendment.
Gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Amadei, Chairman Amadei is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't going to talk, but when I hear about fiscal responsibility from my good friend from Maryland, $19 million, and it's like, well, I guess context is a little bit important. And you talk about tough on terrorism, and ask the people at Quantico about tough on terrorism. So there's a pretty broad discussion there. And by the way, if you close that $19 million base, then you've got people who get the rights that the people who are citizens of this country have by virtue of the Constitution and stuff like that. And so when you talk about tough on terrorism and fiscal responsibility, that opens up a whole new box, which, with all due respect, I don't think anybody here knows where that road will end. And so it's not like, I would just say context is very important. And I don't have fiscal responsibility tattooed anywhere on me, but I think when you look all the way around the compass, that it's a little bit more than 19 million bucks. It's a little bit more on tough on terrorism for that, because there's a lot of stuff going on that we could be mean to each other about that we really shouldn't. And with that, I'll just yield back. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers seeking to be recognized? Seeing none, the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz, recognized to close.
It is just unbelievable to me that somehow we will have ended up spending more time debating whether or not a rainbow flag should be allowed to be flown over VA facilities, or that the people in this room are the ones that should be deciding whether or not a woman can make the most deeply personal medical decisions on her own versus all of us in this room making them for her. It is unbelievable to me that in the largest medical facilities or agency that provides medical services to anyone in America, that we're actually embedding in this bill that we're not going to protect the most vulnerable patients from getting COVID from people who work there. It is unbelievable to me that there's a provision in this bill because Republicans were upset that Democrats asked for information from the VA last year and got it, and then used it to inform the world that they were trying to make a 22% cut in this bill. And now they're trying to prohibit that information from being communicated by the VA. This is a party that seems to regularly be standing up for First Amendment rights recently, I guess unless the information exposed in those First Amendment activities work against them. So lastly, a lot of members here have spent a lot of time on the other side of the aisle professing their devotion to our nation's veterans and our service members and their quality of life. That's what this bill is supposed to be focused on. But yet it seems that the majority has decided that culture war riders and poison pills that have nothing to do with saving veterans from suicide or putting roofs over their head or making sure our service members have a quality of life that they deserve are a higher priority than taking care of them. I yield back and ask members to support this amendment.
Questions now on the amendment offered by Ms. Wasserman Schultz. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Roll call has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. Sufficient number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Amadei? No. Mr. Amadei, no. Mrs. Bice? Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carl? No. Mr. Carl, no. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright? Aye. Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case? Aye. Mr. Case, aye. Mr. Siscomani? Mr. Siscomani, no. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Cloud? No. Mr. Cloud, no. Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Cuellar? Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Mr. DeLauro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Edwards? No. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Elzey? No. Mr. Elzey, no. Mr. Espaillat? Aye. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman, no. Ms. Frankel? Yes. Ms. Frankel, aye. Mr. Franklin? No. Mr. Franklin, no. Mr. Garcia? No. Mr. Garcia, no. Mr. Gonzalez? No. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Guest? No. Mr. Guest, no. Mr. Harder? Aye. Mr. Harder, aye. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Mrs. Hinson? Mrs. Hinson, no. Mr. Hoyer? Yes. Mr. Hoyer, aye. Mr. Joyce? No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Aye. Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mr. LaTurner? No. Mr. LaTurner, no. Ms. Lee of California? Aye. Ms. Lee of California, aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada? Ms. Lee of Nevada, aye. Ms. Letlow? No. Ms. Letlow, no. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. McCollum, aye. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar? No. Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Newhouse, no. Ms. Pingree? Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley, aye. Mr. Reschenthaler? Mr. Reschenthaler, no. Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers, no. Mr. Ruppersberger? Aye. Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford? Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. No. Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson, no. Ms. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Trone? Aye. Mr. Trone, aye. Ms. Underwood? Yes. Ms. Underwood, aye. Mr. Valadeo? Mr. Valadeo, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Yes. Ms. Watson Coleman, aye. Ms. Wexton? Ms. Wexton, aye. Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Womack, no. Mr. Zinke? Nay. Mr. Zinke, no.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 23, the noes are 33. The amendment is not adopted. I now recognize Chairman Carter to offer a Republican en bloc amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This includes report language important to Republican members. It includes an amendment that about community care and wait times at VA. Includes an amendment requiring information from VA about quality of care that veterans who undergo anesthesia receive. It requires information about the status and implementation by VA of Section 413 of last year's Act on Veterans, Second Amendment rights, and the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. It also report language requiring VA to provide updates on the process of starting construction on a new clinic in Bakersfield, California. And finally, includes language regarding sexual assault and other misconduct investigations in VA. I yield back.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Despite my friend's benign description, I rise in opposition to this amendment. This is unfortunately another example of trying to create a partisan divide in this committee by including a partisan amendment full of report language on controversial topics. First, I want to address the NICS reporting language. To put it mildly, there's a stark difference of opinion on this committee on the requirement for VA to report a beneficiary to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System when VA is required by law to do so if that person is determined to be mentally incompetent in handling their finances. The report in the Republican en bloc, I am more than skeptical about the intent behind the report. Knowing we're on opposite sides of this issue is greatly concerning. I mean, if you're interested in understanding the impact of what the NICS provision does, I can tell you what it does. It robs veterans and those around them of protections put in place to help keep them safe from harm. Moving on to the community care expansion report language, this is also not benign language. The Mission Act expanded care in the community in an effort to provide health care and services to places the VA itself couldn't meet the needs of veterans. That was the original intent of the law, and I think we can all agree on that part. We all want to make sure veterans can access the health care that they have earned and deserve. What we don't want to see is a march towards privatization of the VA, which this provision does. And there are strong efforts being made to march towards privatization. We're currently at a crossroads within VA healthcare. Medical community care is growing exponentially, as we warned that it would. And we're not going to be able to support two separate systems of care, especially under these tight fiscal caps. We want to be bringing veterans back into VA for care, A, because that's the care that has proven best for veterans and that they wish to get their care from primarily. Veterans who receive VA health care have better health outcomes than non-enrolled veterans, and VA hospitals have outperformed non-VA hospitals in overall quality ratings and patient satisfaction surveys. It's also more affordable for veterans. Not to mention, and this is really important to note, oftentimes when veterans are eligible and they are sent into the community for care, they actually wait longer for an appointment than they would if they were waiting for care at the VA. So this does not go in the right direction. I don't want to support language that strongly supports the department's efforts to expand veterans' access to timely, high-quality health care in their communities. We want to support access to high-quality health care through the VA. If VA can't provide the care in a timely manner and the community can, then yes, we should let veterans ensure that they can receive that care. But community care should supplement, not supplant, which this provision would send us in the direction of doing, should not supplant VA healthcare. And I strongly oppose further expanding community care in an effort to move closer to privatization of the VA. So with that, I oppose the amendment for those reasons and yield back the balance of my time.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the en bloc amendment? I now recognize Chairman Carter for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. That's enough.
Questions now on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Roll call has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. Sufficient number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amidei. Mr. Amidei, aye. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Yes. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Cloud. Yes. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Aye. Mr. Clyde, aye. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. No. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Elzey. Aye. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. No. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Aye. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Aye. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Aye. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. No. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Hinson. Aye. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. No. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. No. Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. No. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Yes. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. No. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Aye. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Ming. No. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Aye. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Newhouse. Ms. Pingree. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Mr. Rogers.
Aye.
Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. No. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Aye. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres. No. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. No. Mr. Trone, no. Ms. Underwood. No. Ms. Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Aye. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. No. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. No. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Ms. Wexton. Ms. Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Aye. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Aye. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Joyce. Gentleman's recorded as no. I think the gentleman was just recognized as, on his vote. Are there any other members wishing to record or change their vote? Gentleman's not recorded. Are there any other members wishing to record or change their vote? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 33, the noes are 24. The amendment is adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read the amendment.
An amendment offered by Ms. Lee of California on page 50, line 10, strike 133,363,000 and insert 143,363,000. Strike section 4.
Without objection, the reading of the amendments dispensed with. Members recognize Ms. Lee for remarks on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I, of course, ask for unanimous consent to dispense with the reading. Mr. Chairman, this amendment would remove the anti-equity language that the majority inserted into this bill. We can see what's going on here. Republicans have drafted a bill that drastically underfunds key veterans programs, worsens the quality of life for our service members and their families, and hurts military readiness. Now, to get their own members to support it, they loaded it up with a list of discriminatory policy riders, starting with the GOP's vendetta against inclusion and representation and equity. I try not to personalize these attacks on veterans of color, but it's very personal to me as an African American. I am really angered that the majority is targeting the parts of our Veterans Affairs system that make sure that we treat all vets equally, regardless of race, class, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, gender orientation, ability, or religion. We must promote as Americans and as representatives fairness, equality, and equity for everyone. These attacks by Republicans against efforts to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility are really quite despicable. Our nation's veterans represent the full diversity of our nation. We promise to take care of all service members in exchange for their service and sacrifice for this country. If my Republican colleagues truly cared about our veterans, they would not block the programs meant to make sure that we value every veteran equally for their service. Now today, like last year, I'm thinking about my dear father, who was an Army officer, 25 years. He fought in 2 wars and rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Despite facing discrimination as an African American in the military who could not even purchase a home, he remained committed to serving our country. We must not send our country back to the time when my dad had to struggle to get the same respect that any veteran deserves. They deserve to be celebrated and valued for who they are and feel safe in every veteran's hospital, clinic, cemetery, yes, and office. And that's the purpose of diversity offices, that they've served and they will continue to serve within the veteran community. So I hope that my colleagues would support this amendment. Think about all of the veterans of color who have served this country and deserve to be treated like every other veteran. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of Congresswoman Lee's amendment, and I associate myself with her remarks. This bill is prohibiting VA from implementing President Biden's 3 executive orders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and from allowing any diversity, equity, and inclusion training or implementation. All veterans deserve equitable and fair access to the health care and benefits they deserve. VA strives to fairly represent the communities that it serves. Diversity and inclusion foster a healthy workplace environment and promote equal opportunity through smart outreach, retention, and education. Our veterans, who are increasingly diverse themselves, deserve nothing less than that. This bill is also rejecting the President's budget request to fully fund the Office of Resolution Management, Diversity, and Inclusion, and instead cutting the office by $10 million solely to prevent VA from developing or modifying DEA training for the workforce. Among the many things it does, this office works to prevent harassment and discrimination problems, and it heads off costly legal problems for VA, which saves the taxpayers money in the long term. So what is the problem with that? it becomes clearer where this amendment also strikes the prohibition to promote or advance critical race theory, which is clearly not germane to the bill. Again, another provision that has nothing to do with this bill because there are no critical race theory programs at the VA. These provisions are divisive and are clearly just seeking to disenfranchise veterans from the VA. We commit to our servicemen and women that we're going to make the same promises to all of them and that we're going to treat each of them with dignity. Veterans face real issues that the majority doesn't seem to want to focus on: homelessness, high rates of suicide, job placement, and training challenges. But our colleagues have us debating whether VA is allowed to create a civil, respectful environment. I don't understand this. Their priorities are certainly not in the right order, and I urge my colleagues to focus on the realities that veterans face every day and reject this amendment that merely seeks to distract us all from truly uniting and helping them. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Any other speakers seek recognition on the amendment? Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized.
Committee members, I'll be home for Memorial Day. I'll be with my VFW and American Legion auxiliaries. And I'd like to just share with you things I've heard over the past 30 years since becoming a fully engaged adult. I particularly have women who are service members who will come up to me. 30 years ago, it was just awful. You know, they wouldn't let me in. You know, I had all my paperwork. They told me to go to a regular hospital, that they didn't have a bed for a woman, that they didn't want to, you know, deal with my medical issue. It's gotten better, but on Veterans Day, I had another woman veteran come up to me, especially from a rural area. She'd gone to one of the rural VA sites and said, they really encouraged me not to be here at the VA. They wanted me to go, you know, just use my other insurance and go the other place. She was fully entitled to go there. So we've come a long way, but there's still a lot of work to do, especially with women veterans. And I know both chairmen would stand up and do casework and speak out on this. But sometimes we get caught up in one part of the diversity, and we don't see the impact of women veterans who then start talking to themselves and others, saying they don't want us, I'm not going to go there, I'm going to avoid the place. And then I spent a lot of time, as well as I'm sure some of you have if you go back and talk to your caseworkers, of women veterans not feeling welcome in the VA system the way that we want them to. It also happens when they go to apply for loans at banks. People are like, well, what do you mean you're a veteran? Women still run into that by and large too far. And so I know we want to overcome that as a committee, but I know sometimes what has happened is with the outside politics getting involved when we talk about diversity and when we talk about inclusion. So I'll be voting against the amendment today, but I think we as a committee, we as people, as we go forward with Memorial Day, need to reaffirm to make sure every single veteran, regardless of gender, regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of the color of their skin color, know that they're welcome and that they need to be in the line next to everybody getting the same service. With that, I yield back.
Do any other
Sorry, I'm
members?
voting for the amendment.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the gentlelady is recognized for 1 minute to close.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank those that spoke on behalf of this amendment and who care about protecting the rights of all veterans as an essential part of our promise to take care of service members regardless of who they are and honor them for their sacrifice for our country. It's time really for this charade to end and time for Congress to fulfill our responsibility to our veterans who look like many of us in this committee. They deserve to be treated equally like all of you. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility remain a priority within the Department of Veterans Affairs, and I ask for an aye vote.
Questions now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. No. Opinion of the chair, the
Roll
noes
call
have it.
vote, please.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hands. A sufficient number in support. A recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Amade? Mr. Amade? No. Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice? No. Mr. Bishop? Yes. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert? No. Mr. Carl? No. Mr. Carl? No. Mr. Carter?
No.
Mr. Carter? No. Mr. Cartwright? Aye. Mr. Cartwright? Aye. Mr. Case? Aye. Mr. Case? Aye. Mr. Siscomani? No. Mr. Siscomani? No. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Cloud? No. Mr. Cloud? No. Mr. Clyde? Mr. Clyde? No. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar? Aye. Ms. DeLauro?
Aye.
Ms. DeLauro? Aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Diaz-Balart? No. Mr. Edwards? No. Mr. Edwards? No. Mr. Elzey? No. Mr. Elzey? No. Mr. Espaillat? Aye. Mr. Espaillat? Aye. Mr. Fleischman? No. Mr. Fleischman? No. Ms. Frankel? Aye. Ms. Frankel? Aye. Mr. Franklin? No. Mr. Franklin? No. Mr. Garcia? No. Mr. Garcia? No. Mr. Gonzalez? No. Mr. Gonzalez? No. Ms. Granger? No. Ms. Granger? No. Mr. Guest? Mr. Harder? Dr. Harris? No. Dr. Harris? No. Mrs. Hinson? No. Mrs. Hinson? No. Mr. Hoyer? Aye. Mr. Hoyer? Aye. Mr. Joyce? No. Mr. Joyce? No. Ms. Capter? Aye. Ms. Capter? Aye. Mr. Kilmer? Aye. Mr. Kilmer? Aye. Mr. LaTurner? No. Mr. LaTurner? No. Ms. Lee of California? Aye. Ms. Lee of California? Aye. Ms. Lee of Nevada? Ms. Lee of Nevada? Aye. Ms. Letlow? No. Ms. Letlow? No. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. McCollum? Aye. Ms. Ming? Aye. Ms. Ming? Aye. Mr. Molinar? No. Mr. Molinar? No. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Newhouse? No. Mr. Newhouse? No. Ms. Pingree? Mr. Pocan? Aye. Mr. Pocan? Aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Quigley? Aye. Mr. Rushenthaler? Mr. Rogers?
No.
Mr. Rogers? No. Mr. Rippersberger? No. Mr. Rippersberger? No. Yes. Mr. Rippersberger? Aye. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Rutherford? No. Mr. Simpson? No. Mr. Simpson? No. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mr. Trone? Aye. Mr. Trone? Aye. Miss Underwood? Aye. Miss Underwood? Aye. Mr. Valadeo? No. Mr. Valadeo? No. Miss Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Miss Wasserman Schultz? Aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Yes. Miss Watson Coleman? Aye. Miss Wexton? Miss Wexton? Aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack? No. Mr. Zinke? No. Mr. Zinke? No.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Mr. Harder?
How am I recorded?
Gentleman's not recorded.
Record myself as a yes.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Harder? Aye.
Gentleman.
Chairman, I'd like to be recorded as a no.
Mr. Rushenthaler? No.
Any others? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 25, the noes are 33. The amendment is not adopted. There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Clyde of Georgia. Insert the following. Section blank.
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Thank you very much. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of my amendment, which relocates the Reconciliation Memorial, sometimes referred to as the Reconciliation Monument, back to its original location in Arlington National Cemetery. Under the direction of President Biden, the Reconciliation Memorial was removed on December 18, 2023. This monument in Arlington was a powerful symbol of the healing and unification of our nation after the deep divisions of the Civil War. American leaders like President Abraham Lincoln and Union General Ulysses Grant knew that a nation divided could not stand, and they tirelessly worked on promoting reconciliation. In 1898, following the end of the Mexican-American War, President McKinley undertook a process to create a greater national unity. In 1906, President McKinley authorized the construction of the Reconciliation Memorial. Unveiled in 1914 by President Woodrow Wilson, this monument, designed by a Jewish American sculptor, features a woman crowned with an olive wreath symbolizing peace. For over a century, presidents of both parties have understood the purpose of this memorial, the purpose of reconciliation, and have honored it by sending wreaths to the monument. This tradition, showing national unity and respect, has been carried on regardless of the party or politics of the sitting president. Even President Obama understood the Reconciliation Monument in the context of what it stands, which is unity and not division, when he continued on the presidential tradition of sending a wreath to the monument. In doing so, presidents have continued to emphasize the message of this monument: reconciliation and unity, not division. Former Senator Jim Webb, a highly decorated Marine Corps officer and Secretary of the Navy, has strongly supported the preservation of the Reconciliation Memorial because the monument is one of the most potent symbols of healing in our nation and across the globe. Democrat Senator Webb has said that the statue's removal would signify the desire of a, and I quote, deteriorating society to erase the generosity of its past in favor of bitterness and misunderstanding, conjured by those who do not understand the history they seem bent on destroying. And that's his quote. Last year, I led a similar amendment which passed the House floor by voice vote with no opposition prior to the removal of the monument. And I ask the committee to support my adoption, the adoption of my amendment to return the Reconciliation Memorial to the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery. In doing so, we can maintain a critical piece of our national unity and fill the empty spot that now exists in Arlington. Let us unite against the destruction of our history, and let us fight for the principles of healing and unity, which is exactly what this memorial was created to accomplish. Thank you, and I yield back.
Do any other members wish to seek recognition to speak on this amendment?
Yes,
Gentleman
Mr.
from
Chair.
Texas, Judge Carter is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a sensitive matter, and I understand members on all sides may have different positions on this and represent many different districts, and urge the members to vote with this consideration in mind. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wasserman Schultz is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to my colleague's amendment to add a Confederate memorial back to Arlington National Cemetery, which was removed last year. It's hard to believe that we're actually having this discussion in this amendment because it wants to return a memorial to one of the most hallowed places for our military families that honors those who fought and killed U.S. service members, thousands of whom are buried there. Congress has already spoken on this issue in the FY2021 NDAA with the creation of the Naming Commission. That commission recommended removal of the memorial along with the review of bases with Confederate names. Arlington National Cemetery, which honors our nation's heroes, is not an appropriate venue for a Confederate memorial. The Bipartisan Naming Commission recognized this fact by recommending its removal. If there had been a way to provide historically accurate context for the memorial at Arlington while being respectful of the men and women buried there, the commission could have recommended to do so. Instead, the commission recommended its removal. We should not be relitigating that debate today. Moreover, why are we spending time here today debating returning a Confederate memorial instead of, again, talking about the very real issues that affect our current service members, their families, and our veterans? There are barracks that our service members live in which are in disrepair, infrastructure deficiencies affecting military readiness, and a host of other issues that we could be discussing right now. The Commission is tasked with finding historically appropriate ways of displaying Confederate monuments and other historical markers in an appropriate way. That is their responsibility and that what they should be left to continue doing, not relitigating decisions that this Congress already made and tasked the Naming Commission to make. Instead, we are discussing this proposal, which would have the department spend more money and more time on an insensitive memorial that honors the Confederacy. I urge all of my colleagues to join me in opposing the amendment, and I yield back.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment? Ms. Lee of California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment to reinstall the Confederate Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. The removal of this memorial is an important step in dismantling the systems that hold us back. We cannot ignore the truth of our history, and these statues represent and that these statues represent and celebrate. And that's why I reintroduced again the Confederate Monument Removal Act this Congress, which would prohibit Confederate statues in the National Statuary Hall of the United States Capitol. As long as these hateful symbols stand, they are condoning racism, bigotry, and men who committed treason against the United States in an effort to uphold the institution of slavery. They have no place in our society, especially at Arlington National Cemetery. Earlier, we talked about, in my amendment, referenced dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and funding in our bill here. Now you want to restore hateful, racist, bigoted symbols. What does this picture say? What does this mean as you look at what we're doing in this bill on issues relating to racism, bigotry, and hate? You dismantle DEI, where we're trying to afford equity and justice to people who have not yet been afforded true equality in this country, and yet here you want to restore hateful symbols. It's a shame and disgrace. We shouldn't honor those who betrayed our country and fought to preserve slavery. I strongly oppose this amendment, and I encourage all my colleagues to join me in voting no.
Do any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment? Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Let me just make a brief observation. It will be ironic if in the name of reunification, we adopt an extraordinarily divisive amendment. I urge its defeat.
Any other members seek recognition to speak on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
A gentlelady from Ohio is
Yes,
recognized.
I just wanted to express respect for all of the members of this committee, and as we approach Memorial Day, to place on the record that of all the wars in which this nation has been involved, the most costly was one, none of us were alive then, but where brother fought brother, state fought state. I come from a free state of Ohio. I'm very proud of that. But I think because of the wounds that remain even until today, those wounds exist inside our military. We've had some discussions here. They exist inside our school systems till today. There are foreign powers that seek to rub salt into those wounds, that this might not be the best way to achieve the gentleman's goal, which I guess would be acknowledgement of how deep the wounds truly are. And I would hate for just one monument in one cemetery, as important as Arlington is, to cause more division in this country. So I would just say to the chairman of the full committee, this is an issue that perhaps needs to be discussed in a more appropriate forum. We've assigned departments and agencies to think about this, but to choose one memorial in one place, particularly during Memorial Day week, I think is very inappropriate. And I know the gentleman last year had different amendments. And I've learned in my own life how deep the scars of racism are. And also, as Congresswoman McCollum was talking about, the treatment of women. I applied to the Air Force Academy when I was a youngster, and I was rejected because I was a woman. Now I have something to do with their budget. So maybe there, maybe justice prevails in the end. But I respect the gentleman's desire to be truthful, and your persistence in this tells me that you feel that there is injustice somewhere. I don't think it can be solved in this committee. And what you are attempting to do, I think, needs to be dealt with in a larger context, and I think we as a country have to do that. And one of the challenges of our country is so that our people understand our history, And so this particular monument, what you're trying to do, sits in a much larger context, one in which I perceive as whether or not the nation would allow the institution of slavery to proceed west. And 600,000 and more of our people died back then. My ancestors weren't even here then. But I think we need to admit that history, we need to share it, and we need to find an appropriate way to do it. I just wanted to place those comments on the record. I urge opposition.
Is there any further debate? Seeing none, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first, I would say that this has nothing to do with division and everything to do with unity. That's what this monument was designed to do, and it was designed to bring together those who actually fought the war. None of us were there. They were the actual ones that decided to build this monument toward unification. So this should not be a partisan issue, in my opinion. And I would hope that everyone would want unity for this nation and would recognize the historic attempt to bring healing and unity to this great country and return this monument to its rightful place in Arlington. With that, I encourage a yes vote on this amendment, and I yield back.
Questions now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hand. Sufficient?
Insufficient.
Sufficient number in support. Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll. We did?
Insufficient.
I'm sorry? Oh, failed by voice vote. Not enough members have raised their hands. Failed by voice vote. Are there further amendments? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cloud, is recognized.
Hello. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to, do you need to read the amendment, or are we good? I have an amendment at the desk.
There's an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read the amendment.
An amendment offered by Mr. Cloud of Texas.
I can move to waive the reading of my one-sentence amendment.
Without objection.
This amendment would simply set aside funds for the planning and design of a child development center at Corpus Christi Naval Air Station. And I will read the Department of Defense information paper on this facility. It says the existing CDC footprint is less than 50% of the requirement to support the demand from the local active duty military and DoD civilian population. As a result, service members and civilians undergo hardship as they look for alternative childcare options to be able to meet the demands of their full-time job responsibilities. I've been to this facility. To say it's aged would be an understatement. To say it is, there's areas that don't even have air conditioning. Most of the kitchens there, we would not accept, the kitchen there, we would not accept as acceptable in most of our homes, yet they are there to feed multiple people. They need a professional kitchen. This facility needs to be rebuilt. And I've been working on this for quite some time. I tried to submit a CPF for it and was told that our rules would not permit that. And so I do appreciate the report language that was included in this bill. I would say that as a member of Congress and as this committee, I wish I was not limited to the report language. I think it's important that we go beyond that. The rules prohibiting the community project funding toward this is because it's not on the unfunded priorities list. Now, I would say that this should be on the unfunded priorities list, but even having said that, as we deal with recruiting issues, taking care of our men and women who are entering in our military should be a prime priority. But even having said that, we should not be limited constitutionally to what the Pentagon says are our priorities. Now, we should take in their advice, no doubt, because they are the experts in the field. But we are a citizen-driven military, and to put ourselves in a box and to suggest that they have to give us permission to decide what the priorities should be, I think is the wrong way to approach this. So, I have been told that with the current rules, however, that this amendment would be ruled out of order. So in the spirit of that, I will withdraw this amendment and ask that we continue to work on this issue because these child care facilities are so important. Thank you, and I yield back.
Do any other amendments seek recognition?
I do have one more amendment. And
Only is
I ask unanimous consent to, again, waive the reading of my one-sentence amendment. This amendment is very similar to the last one. It sets aside funds for planning and design of barracks located at the Naval Air Station in Corpus Christi. And I will read you again what the Department of Defense information paper says on the barracks, which have been condemned, I will point out. So it says the 236,500 square feet barracks was condemned due to its inhabitable condition and is being demolished. As a result, single sailors are forced to rent off the base and are experiencing financial hardship as affordable rentals in safe neighborhoods are limited, in addition to the expense of having to buy furniture and pay utilities. The single E4 and below BAH rate for Corpus Christi is $1,164 a month. Once you take into account the difference in the average rental rate, utilities, and rental insurance costs, the average out-of-pocket expense is greater than $300 a month, and I would say that's probably gone up even since then. A 60-room barracks would satisfy Naval Air Station Corpus Christi's current unaccompanied housing needs. And again, this is something that I tried to submit as a CPF and was told that I could not do that. Now, I would point out the absurdity in that if you look through last year's funding bill, there are plenty CPFs regarding housing, but for many different reasons and many different communities and many different preferred populations. But the fact that I'm asking for one for our military personnel who our Navy is trying to train to fly planes for us, I am not permitted to, according to our rules, because once again, it does not appear on the unfunded priorities list. Now, that's a problem in and of itself. It should be on the unfunded priorities list. But again, I will point out this is why we should be able to decide. We should not be limited by that list, but we should be able to definitely, certainly take it into account. But we should address this issue urgently because it needs to be taken care of. But once again, realizing the current rules, I recognize that this amendment will be ruled out of order. And so I will withdraw it and ask this committee to continue to work on this issue. Thank you, Chairman.
Any
for your
other
indulgence. And I will yield back.
I want to recognize a distinguished gentleman from Texas, Chairman Carter.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cloud, you know, our office has been concerned about what you brought to our attention.
Yes, sir.
This Corpus Christi Naval Base is training our pilots. We have a lot of Navy pilots around here. So we need to seriously get together and have conversations with the Navy and see if we can't do something about this. I'll be willing to talk with them for you, and hopefully we'll get some solutions next time, okay?
Yes.
Or maybe even this time later on. But
Thank you, Chairman.
right now, we can't do it basically because of our tradition of following what they request. So therefore, but I will, I promise, work with you on this, try to get some of our pilots, if we can wake them up to go too, okay? So thank you very much.
Are there any further amendments? Seeing no further amendments, I now recognize Mr. Rogers for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I move to favorably report the fiscal year 2025 Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and related agencies appropriations bill to the House.
The question is now on the motion to favorably report the fiscal year 2025 Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and related agency appropriations bill to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. And the motion's to agreed to. A recorded vote's been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, please raise your hand. Sufficient number in support. Recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Amade. Mr. Amade, aye. Mrs. Bice. Mrs. Bice, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carl. Aye. Mr. Carl, aye. Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. No. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. No. Mr. Case, no. Mr. Siscomani. Yes. Mr. Siscomani, aye. Mr. Klein. Aye. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Cloud. Aye. Mr. Cloud, aye. Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde, no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Edwards. Aye. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Elzey. Aye. Mr. Elzey, aye. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Ms. Frankel. No. Ms. Frankel, no. Mr. Franklin. Mr. Franklin, aye. Mr. Garcia. Aye. Mr. Garcia, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Aye. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Ms. Granger. Aye. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest, aye. Mr. Harder. No. Mr. Harder, no. Dr. Harris. Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Mrs. Hinson. Aye. Mrs. Hinson, aye. Mr. Hoyer. Mr. Hoyer, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Captor. No. Ms. Captor, no. Mr. Kilmer. No. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mr. LaTurner. Aye. Mr. LaTurner, aye. Ms. Lee of California. No. Ms. Lee of California, no. Ms. Lee of Nevada. Ms. Lee of Nevada, no. Ms. Letlow. Aye. Ms. Letlow, aye. Ms. McCollum. Ms. McCollum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Aye. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Morelli. Mr. Morelli, no. Mr. Newhouse. Aye. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Ms. Pingree. Mr. Pocan. No. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Quigley. No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Reschenthaler. Aye. Mr. Reschenthaler, aye. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger. No. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Aye. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Simpson. Aye. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Trone. No. Mr. Trone, no. Miss Underwood. No. Miss Underwood, no. Mr. Valadeo. Aye. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Miss Wasserman Schultz. No. Miss Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. No. Miss Watson Coleman, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, no. Mr. Womack. Aye. Miss Womack, aye. Mr. Zinke. Aye. Mr. Zinke, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Gentleman from Alabama.
Mr. Adderholt votes aye.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Diaz-Balart votes aye.
Gentleman,
Mr. Clyde is recorded as a no.
you're recorded as a no.
Mr. Clyde votes aye.
Any others? Clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 34, the noes are 25. The motion is agreed to. Gentleman from Maryland. Okay, I ask unanimous consent that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and report and the report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered.
Chairman Cole, ask 3 days for the minority to file its.
Without objection, so ordered. There being no further business, the committee, gentleman from Texas recognized.
I want to thank everybody for moving this along. I'm going to tell my wife that you were very kind to me today and to her. Thank you.
There being no further business, the committee stands adjourned.